virgin of varied forms, wandering through the heavens, bull-faced, three-headed, ruthless, with golden arrows, chaste Phoebe bringing light to mortals, Ilithea bearing the three sacred signs of a triple nature. In the ether I appear in fiery forms, and in the air I sit in a silver chariot. This quote is from the Chaldean Oracles, a 2nd century CE text, the translation from Johnson, 1990, in her book Agati Sorita. Greetings everybody, this is Sorita DSD and I'm recording this talk, and it is a talk rather than me reading a paper, called Crossroads of Illumination for the Scottish Pagan Federation 2020 online conference. Those of you familiar with my work will probably have guessed that this talk is going to be mostly centered around my work and my passion, research and experience of the goddess Agati. Agati is a goddess of the crossroads and of illumination. She's a multifaceted, multiformed goddess that is most often thought of in her triple form today, where 3 women stand back to back around a central pillar facing outwards, holding different symbols associated with the mysteries of Agati. These 3-formed icons of Agati are very well known today, and in history they were also frequently the way in which Agati was depicted. But, like today, she was also depicted in a singular form, as a single-bodied, single-headed female. More rarely, she was also depicted with a double head or a quadruple head. But the single-headed and triple-headed form of Agati are the forms that have been best known from the very earliest recordings of Agati right through to 2020, the 21st century, where Agati continues to be honoured and where devotees continue to make offerings to her. Sometimes there are variations on this. It could be a single body with 3 heads, for example. And on occasion, the heads are not that of an adult female, but also that of a bull, a boar, a cow, a snake, a dog, a wolf, a lion, a dragon, or a goat, or a horse even. In these more animalistic forms of the goddess, these animal-headed forms of the goddess, she is also usually shown with the body of an adult female. When she's given a human head, the age of the woman could be said to be that of a young or adult female, but she's never shown as an old woman. Now, the reason I mention this is because in the late 20th century, it became very popular for pagans to view Agati as part of a triple goddess, maiden, mother and crone, and Agati was frequently placed in the crone position. It's a bit of a bugbear of mine, because although I feel that it's valid within a modern context, if somebody would step forward and say this is the way I've experienced her, then I have no issue with it. But it is not a historical depiction of her. Just so historically, Agati is always described as a maiden. She's described as a mother, the mother of the gods even, but there's no descriptions of her as being a crone, as being an old woman. Wisdom and knowledge is of course associated with old age, and there's no doubt about it that Agati is a very ancient, a primordial goddess. So the concepts that are often associated with Hecate when she's in the crone form are still very valid and very recognizable as being part of her historical worship. Now, historical worship is all good and well, but Hecate, of course, is a living goddess. She continues to be honored and worshipped and contemplated and evoked today by people of many different spiritual traditions, magical traditions, and in many geographical regions which would have been familiar to devotees of the ancient world, because Hecate was worshipped all throughout, literally throughout, the entire Greek and Roman empires. Now, what's important is, of course, that the modern Greek state and the ancient Greek empire is not exactly the same geographic area. Hecate, like the other gods that were worshipped by the Greeks, had devotion given to her in countries and in regions which are not part of the Greek state today. So, for example, many of her shrines, and perhaps her most famous and largest temple today, can be found in Turkey. But it dates from a time that Hellenistic Greece had that region as part of its own empire. Likewise, Egypt, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Russia, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Sicily, and other parts of southern Italy are all places where evidence for the worship of Hecate in antiquity can be found. Today, however, when we look for evidence of Hecate, we will find, if you were to look, shrines to her in Australia, New Zealand, all over the Americas, from Canada right down to Chile, and lots of devotees in Brazil, Mexico, the USA, of course, as well, and all throughout Europe, including Britain, which is where I live today and where many who are listening to this probably also lives. So the geographical associations with Hecate and modern Greece is correct, but she was a much more widely worshipped goddess than that, and today she's even more widely worshipped. Her origins, however, were also thought to be outside of the Greek, even the ancient Greek world. It's thought that perhaps she had her origins in Caria, Anatolia, these are parts of modern Turkey today, or that she had earlier roots in Thrace, perhaps in Persia. There's even some very faint whispers that suggest that she may have had earlier worship in places like Minoan Crete. So Hecate was a very universally worshipped goddess, not obscure, but slightly outside of the normative state religions. But so was a lot of other gods and spirits that were honoured in the ancient world. And so are a lot of deities that are still honoured today. In fact, depending on which country you live in, the normative is most likely not Hecate. And that is true for many, many other deities as well. Hecate was associated with crossroads, hence the title of my talk. And the crossroads of Hecate were and are both physical crossroads as well as spiritual crossroads. Because crossroads are symbolically places where decisions are made, choices are made. They're dangerous places, crossroads are, because if you make the wrong decision, then you may find that you waste your time or that you get yourself in trouble. And in the ancient world, crossroads were considered dangerous places because they were the places that people most often passed through on journeys, wanderers, travellers, and therefore the places that they were most likely to be robbed. They were places where the dead was thought to dwell sometimes as well. But Hecate, of course, was not the only goddess worshipped at the crossroads. Alongside her, frequently, the god Hermes would be honoured at crossroads, as well as the god Apollo. These two gods are two of the deities that are frequently found together in the mysteries of Hecate, frequently found as companions to her, frequently found in places where she was worshipped. But so were and are gods like Zeus, Dionysus, Helios, and the goddesses Demeter, Persephone, Artemis. All of these are found not at the crossroads, but in the stories and mixed into the places in which Hecate was worshipped. I will touch a little later on the mysteries of Eleusis, which for those unfamiliar with the story is the story of Demeter and Persephone, the story of Persephone being abducted by Hades and becoming queen of the underworld, and more importantly perhaps, the story of the seasons, summer and winter, a time of plenty and a time that the earth becomes barren. But back to the crossroads. Crossroads are places of decision, physical decision as well as spiritual decision. Now, some of the choices we make when we are faced with choices can be very fast. Sometimes we don't need to even consciously contemplate or think about our choices because we are conditioned and we have learned to respond in a certain way. Now, what I've learned over the years about the mysteries of Agati is that by exploring her through ritual, through invocation, but also through study and contemplation, meditation, and by talking to other people that have had tremendously intense, life-transforming experiences with this goddess, the one thing that becomes apparent is that she seems to encourage her devotees to question what they are told, to look beyond the obvious, to look beyond whatever society is asking from them, and to make decisions based on their own information, on their own experiences. So when you find yourself at a crossroads, and these crossroads could include going to the supermarket and deciding which supermarket to go to. They can be deciding how many drinks to have down the pub when the pub's open again one day. It could be deciding on whether to do your daily devotion and to tend your shrine to a deity that you honour, or whether to sit on Facebook or Instagram and basically bide your time clicking like on your friends' images and posts with the hope that they will respond with a like on yours. So many decisions that have to be made every day in regards to our spiritual work and in regards to our daily lives. Now, our ultimate choices, the thing that we choose, is usually dictated by circumstance. Perhaps you've got to buy the cheaper product because you don't have money for the more expensive product. But with Agati, I find that it's a question of orientating yourself at the crossroads. And that orientation comes through experience and study, a familiarity with the symbols of the goddess and the symbols and stories that is important to her devotees. So some years ago, I'm involved in a network of devotees from different traditions. We've got people worshipping her or calling upon her in many different ways, some very experienced, some less so, and we just all share our work. Some people create rituals and share them. Sometimes there's collaborative projects as well. But we have 5 virtues in the covenant of Agati. The virtues are compassion, courage, temperance, justice and wisdom. Compassion, courage, temperance, justice and wisdom. And how we came to have these 5 virtues was by a discussion involving dozens and dozens and dozens of comments from different devotees saying which qualities, in their own words, saying which qualities they most associated with Agati and their experience of her. This was then concentrated and simplified and assigned to the various virtues, and these 5 virtues was what we ended up with, and they are the virtues that devotees decided was most often associated with her. So such virtues can be part of the way in which we approach the choices that we make. So when shopping, we can make a decision on which product to buy or not to buy based on wisdom, on justice. Justice would include things like fair trade or buying organic or not buying things that are wasteful or unnecessary. Temperance, not having too much of something. Courage, the courage to go against the normative views that others hold and therefore not being pressurized into doing something that you know isn't really something you want to do or need to do. So you can see how all of these virtues can be applied to Agati, and also how they can be applied to daily choices. So when we find ourselves at a crossroads, we have to approach the choices we have, and we have to act. And from a spiritual perspective, when it comes to Agati, acting, I feel, is a really important thing to know about. Just like it is when you're driving a car. So sorry to bring it back to the mundane, but if you're driving a car and you find yourselves at a normal road, crossroads, there might be a stop sign or a traffic light that will dictate how you make your decision on crossing over, even if you are continuing on straight. In the same way, we've got to act at the crossroads on the symbols and this information that we have available. And the more knowledge we have, the more informed choices we can make. And that's just really, really simplifying this. We don't have the option when we're sitting in our car at a busy traffic light at a crossroads to not act. If we don't act, we'll be causing a traffic jam behind us and a lot of angry people. But we would also not get to our destination. So without acting based on the symbols and signs available to us in that moment, we are not going to reach our desired destination. Now, like I said, you need to know the signs, and sometimes they're obvious and sometimes they're not. So when one is faced with a decision at the crossroads, one needs to step back and look at the signs. So an example of an obvious sign that most of us are familiar with is traffic lights. When it's green, we can go. Another sign that's very obvious is the sun. So if we need to navigate ourselves and we see the sun is just about to set, we know that if we head towards the sun, we are heading in a more or less westerly direction. So we can orientate ourselves. Using principial qualities such as the 5 virtues, compassion, courage, temperance, justice, or wisdom, or your own values, the things that you hold dear, the things that you believe in, is the best way to achieve this. And in order to do this, you need to know your own values. Now, this is a difficult topic within modern paganism and witchcraft because values are often considered something belonging to more mainstream religions and somehow considered sometimes a bad thing or an uncomfortable topic. But the goddess Hecate and uncomfortable topics is perhaps bedfellows in more than one way. And therefore, just because something is uncomfortable does not mean that it's something to be avoided, something to not listen to. So knowing your values is an incredibly important step to take in your spiritual practice or your magical practice with Hecate, but also with any other deity. I'm sure this stuff applies to everybody, even if they're an atheist, knowing your values and making those decisions. But with Hecate, there's a stronger symbolic association, perhaps. She has a very close association with Crossroads. And more often than not, this association is thought to be because shrines were made for her at Crossroads. And at these shrines, offerings would be left. Hecate was also associated with roads in general. And when we think of roads and crossroads today, but also in the ancient world, they are liminal points. I've talked a lot about decision and orientating yourself. And liminal points are places where that becomes necessary. Doors, gates, rivers, frontiers of any sort are places where we need to make decisions. They are often uncertain places, and in the ancient world they required many special rituals. Well, I actually believe they still have many special rituals associated with them today. Maybe not esoteric if you're not esoterically minded, but a symbol for stop, a symbol for the traffic lights, symbols for give way, are all things that we interpret when we get to a crossroads and to a crossing, when we're driving, even when we're walking and crossing on a pedestrian crossing. There are symbols and signs that we recognize in order to know that it's a pedestrian crossing. And if it's got a traffic light, then we have the ritual of pressing the button, waiting for the little green man to appear, and then walking across the road gleefully and confidently. So there are many rituals that we still have at these places. We just don't necessarily think of it as esoteric rituals, but certainly repetitive actions that we make. Hecate perhaps was a natural choice for a goddess to have at the crossroads, especially the three-way crossroads, and the goddess with 3 faces facing in 3 directions. It's obvious that she could have a protecting an evil averting function in this way. So shrines were erected to her at Crossroads, as they were also to Hermes and sometimes to Apollo. Today, of course, we have many roadside shrines to the dead when there's been car accidents. So rituals of roadside and crossroad shrines are still being followed. And in some Mediterranean countries, including Greece, you often find the different saints are also honoured at roadsides and crossroads today. So things have perhaps changed, but not changed that much. We still have our rituals at roads and crossroads and at other liminal places. So much has been said and written about the so-called offerings that were left for Hecate at the crossroads, but there's a little bit of confusion about this. Agati is a goddess that have attracted a lot of misinformation. So sometimes that misinformation is because of misinterpretation. Sometimes it's because of ignorance or lack of information. And sometimes I think it is because the information comes from a time that we didn't have access to as many sources of literature and archaeological finds as we do today. And in other words, we know more today than we did 10 years ago or 100 years ago about this time in history and about the worship of these gods. So there were 3 types of offerings that were left for Hecate and also other crossroad gods and spirits. And these offerings were often ritualized, but for different purposes. So one of the first things to realize, if you've heard about the ritual offerings to Hecate at Crossroads, is that not all offerings were necessarily left for her. And that's important because we don't always know, when we've got evidence for an offering, what the reason was for that. And writers and archaeologists often have to interpret the evidence within the context of their own knowledge. And hopefully they get it right a lot of the time, but it is also possible for them to, of course, make mistakes sometimes. You only have to go to museums sometimes to know that items are wrongly labelled or labelled in a very vague way that might not be very helpful if you take that information as a fact. So the 3 types of offering that was left at Crossroads, which may have also been left for Hecate, is the first is the offerings of the portions of the sacrifice which was not used in the ceremony. So the offering of portions of the sacrifice which were not used in the ceremony. And this included things like waste, blood and water, because of course a lot of offerings made in temples would have included animal sacrifices, flesh sacrifices, the meat of which were often eaten in a feast to the deities. So not very different from going to a barbecue with friends and having a feast to celebrate somebody's birthday or a special occasion. However, I should say that I'm vegan. I know many of Hecate's devotees who are also vegan or vegetarian, and many who are omnivores that eat anything. So the necessity for blood offerings, if you are not actually going to partake in feasting on the flesh of the animal, is a little bit ambiguous, and I feel completely and utterly unnecessary for 21st century devotees. I should also add, because this is obviously part of the crossroads in history of Hecate, that devotees and the priests that made the sacrifices would have had knowledge of slaughter. They would have had knowledge of the appropriate spiritual and magical practices to follow as part of such sacrifices, just like other traditions that are still alive and flourishing today, and who do make sacrifices of flesh that is used in different ways, have very set rituals and traditions in which the practices are passed from initiate to initiate. So this is not something to just go out and do. It's not a normal practice for 21st century devotees, and it's not an offering that was killed at the crossroads. It was killed elsewhere in a ceremonial context, and then the waste blood and water was taken to the crossroads. Sometimes these kinds of leftovers that were not used in the ceremony would also be burned. So the modern equivalent of that may be that if you pick flowers and gather fruits and berries as an offering for the goddess, then you may tidy it all up and take the leaves off the stems of the flowers, and those leaves which are not offered on the altar would fall into this off-scourings category of offerings. They would still be taken to the crossroads as an offering. The term off-scourings and that category of offering was also sometimes applied to scapegoats. This is animals, and in rare occasions humans, that were sacrificed in the ancient world to avert some kind of natural or what they believed to be otherworldly calamity, such as drought or plague. I, again, do not condone these kinds of practices, but scapegoating was something that was practiced a lot at the crossroads. And this is when the other kind of side of it is when offerings were made, sometimes of an animal, when the person making the offering wanted to purify themselves, cleanse themselves of some kind of wrongdoing, and come out of it purified and good. Today, I don't feel that this is an appropriate thing to do. There are other ways that if you feel like you've done something wrong, that you can correct those wrongs. So again, not something I condone, but something that did happen historically for deities and spirits at crossroads and roads. Sometimes maybe for Hecate. We don't have any, or I can't think of any known examples of Hecate being associated with animal sacrifices. Sorry, not animal, with human sacrifices. Just like there are many examples, on the other hand, of the goddess Artemis being linked to the sacrifice of humans. So it's kind of strange sometimes how Hecate is branded as a dark goddess, and a goddess like Artemis associated with much happier ideas and ideals. I'm fond of both goddesses, but I feel that maybe we need to see beyond a veil of illusion sometimes that have been created. So the second type of offering left at the crossroads would be the remains of the sacrifices. These are things that were placed on the altar and then cleaned up. So they are the cleansings. So it might be the eggs, or in the case of Hecate, sometimes we know of a couple of instances where it involved the bodies of dogs, which may or may not have been something to do with scapegoating as well, but we don't know. We have a quote from a 1st century CE Roman historian, Plutarch, who wrote, "Dogs are carried out to Hecate with the other Catharsia, and also when it, the dog, is sent to the crossroads as a supper for the earth goddess Hecate, it has its due portion among sacrifices that avert and expiate evil." So again, some kind of purification, some kind of evil averting function that happened by taking the remains of the sacrifices, the leftovers that wasn't eaten and wasn't used and wasn't burned, to the crossroads. Then the third type is, it translates as sharp anger. And these were baked clay censers used to fumigate the house for protection. Same thing, essentially. The equivalent today for some people is the so-called sage smudge wands, maybe the leftovers from that. But I think it's nice to have a little clay censer, and it's a practice that we can still follow. So in this clay censer, clay because it was cheap, easily available and plentiful, something would be burned as a fumigation for the house, and then afterwards the household cleansings would be taken and burned on the censer at the crossroads. And the idea was again that it purified the house, both physically because the house has been swept and the cleansings removed, and that it spiritually also cleanses the house energetically, if you like. So these kinds of offerings obviously link in with household offerings to Hecate, and they could have served different purposes. Now, these crossroads rituals that may have happened to Hecate, because a lot of the evidence we have for these rituals doesn't make it clear who the offerings were made for. Just in the same way that a modern devotee might take some fruit down to the crossroads and leave it there, or another kind of offering and leave it at the crossroads, without an inscription to Hecate, without an image of Hecate being attached to it, or whichever deity they are honouring. Later archaeologists cannot interpret these offerings very accurately necessarily, or the writings very accurately, so it becomes a little bit ambiguous. But offerings were definitely made to Hecate at the crossroads. And we have some fantastic references from Aristophanes. Now, he was a satirist, and how accurate this is from a religious or magical perspective, we don't know. But it was considered important enough that 14 centuries later, in the Byzantine pseudos, the same kind of information is relayed again. So Aristophanes said, "Ask Hecate whether it's better to be rich or starving, and she will tell you that the rich send her a meal every month, and that the poor make it disappear before it is even served." And we find very similar ideas in the Byzantine pseudo. From her one may learn whether it's better to be rich or go hungry, for she says that those who have and who are wealthy should send her dinner each month, but that the poor amongst mankind should snatch it before they put it down, for it was customary for the rich to offer loaves and other things to Hecate every month, and for the poor to take it from them. So this is a later record which may have been based on something that evolved from Aristophanes, or it may be that Aristophanes was referring to something that was happening at the crossroads for Hecate and at the roadsides for Hecate, and therefore this later reference. We can interpret this as some kind of act of charity, with the rich leaving offerings for Hecate, perhaps because they want a favour from her, perhaps because they feel that they need some kind of purification, but they are leaving offerings for her. Then we have to know that these offerings were left perhaps at the dark moon, and we speak about these sometimes as Deipna, as the offerings of the crossroads, the offerings to Hecate, and it's still a very popular thing today. But interestingly, we have another echo of something similar associated with Hecate. the so-called equality meals that was offered in the cult of Zeus Panamoros. Here, Hecate was worshipped alongside Zeus in Caria in Anatolia, part of modern-day Turkey. No mentions of a crossroads, but food was offered on tables, and here the rich and the poor, regardless of social and cultural status, were invited to eat together. We continue to see similar practices, of course, today in the East, where, for example, at the Golden Temple of the Sikhs in Amritsar, meals are offered to all visitors and everybody is treated in exactly the same way, get exactly the same food and sit in long rows with no regard for social standing or wealth. So these kinds of practices do continue in religious context. The rituals offered on the 30th day, now the 30th day being the dark moon, the day that the moon is not visible, because when we have references to the 1st or the 30th, 13th, in the context of ancient calendars, this is to do with the lunar month. And so the last day was the day of the dark moon, and it was dedicated to the dead. And this taking of sweepings and dirt from the house to the crossroads was also sometimes done at graves. So in a way, we can see the dead here as being the ancestors. And suddenly, the word ancestor makes a lot more sense, that there's some kind of practice linking the honouring of Hecate at the crossroads and Hecate at the gravesides with the dead, but the dead as our ancestors. And that is a universal practice found in many religious contexts, and it doesn't sound quite as scary somehow. The celebrations sometimes took place for 2 or 3 days, and they were very widespread. So widespread that Solon's law in the 6th century BCE, amongst other things, tried to ban these 30th day rites, the trikostia. The practices were mostly done by women of the house to ward off evil spirits, and it was done after deaths in the household and immediately after funerals were held. And the purpose was to purify the house of the spirit of the deceased. So it's said that Solon's law was a likely attempt at replacing superstitious practices with more hygienic ones. So if it's replacing superstitious practices with more hygienic ones, then it's likely that for whatever reason these practices were so popular that it created a bit of a mess to clean up afterwards, perhaps even causing some problems. Solon's attempt failed, but it provides us with a very unique record and insight into these practices during this period, which is quite an early period. So I think that a modern day equivalent, which many devotees do follow, is actually making food offerings to food banks. Supermarkets often have the facilities for one to donate food, and that would be an easy way of continuing on with this practice in a devotional context. But coming back to the crossroads of a spiritual nature, when we are able to read the symbols, we can make the correct decisions, because I went off on a bit of a tangent there, if I'm honest. But I hope you enjoyed that. And when we're making spiritual decisions, but also practical, physical ones in the modern day, it's important to pull back the veils of ignorance and delusion, and to look beyond the intellectual and the emotional that might block you from seeing with clarity what the correct decision might be, and also what the correct way might be to interpret the symbols that we encounter. Using again Hecate as an example, we find that this goddess is often referred to as a goddess of darkness. But she's also the light bearer, the torch bearer, the lamp bearer. She sometimes manifests as a pillar of light. For example, she was petitioned by Thrasybulus, I hope I pronounced that correctly, for help when he was imprisoned. And she helped him escape. He was wrongfully imprisoned. She helped him escape and guided him to safety by appearing as a pillar of light that he followed. And he thanked her by erecting a sanctuary to her at the place that he got to have his safety. Likewise, Agati in ancient Byzantium, which became Constantinople, modern Istanbul, when ancient Byzantium was under siege from Philip II of Macedonia, better known as the father of Alexander the Great, they also petitioned the goddess for help. And here she woke them on the night that Philip's men decided to attack. And she woke them through the baying of dogs, something associated so much with the mysteries of Agati. And Phosphoros, the name she was called under here, also lit up the body of water, today called the Bosphorus, which again, there's some very interesting connotations to that, but that would be a complete diversion. She lit it up with a mysterious light, and it's said that this light, together with the atmosphere of the baying of hounds, caused a fear to spread amongst the men of Philip II, and many of them fled. Philip could not persuade them to stay. So Byzantium was saved by Phosphoros from this attack. Agati and her torches brings us to an interesting dilemma, because if we refer to her as a goddess of darkness, how is it possible that light is a reference to darkness? So there's many ways in which we can interpret this illumination, this light of hers. Now, firstly, her torches that she holds aloft are very closely linked also with the mystery cults, especially that of Eleusis, where it's one of the primary symbols, and where Agati is seen brandishing two torches, leading Demeter up into the world of Helios, where she finds the information she needs to bring back her daughter to the world of the living. And we also see those two torches when Agati is guiding Persephone on her yearly journey to Hades, into the world of the dead, into the underworld, and then back again into the world of the living on the earth. Agati has the ability to traverse the liminal, to traverse between the living and the dead, the world and the underworld, but also the different realms associated with her, the ocean, the earth, and the heavens. So a goddess like no other really, because the only deity other than Agati that clearly has these abilities is probably Hermes, the messenger god, who also plays an important part in the Eleusinian mysteries. But the important thing in the Eleusinian mysteries is that these torches were very much part of the rituals that were enacted in public and was visible for all to see. They had a practical purpose of illuminating the dark, but also a highly symbolic one. And when Agati and Demeter travels to Helios, perhaps this is where we can see that it's symbolic and not just a physical, practical symbol, because Helios is the sun. And the reason they go to him is because he's in the sun, is in the sky, he sees all, and so the hope is that he knows what happened to Persephone in the story. But significantly, both Demeter and Agati are described as bearing torches when they go to Helios, and there would be no reason whatsoever to have a torch to illuminate the light around you when you're going to be in the company of the god of the sun. So the torches are symbols of illumination. And the way I have often thought about this is that the torches of Hecate illuminates that which is usually unseen. It allows you to see what is really there. And this can be an uncomfortable experience because many of us prefer the illusions that we create for ourselves about our own lives, about the world we live in, because it's comfortable, it's familiar, and it's easy. A journey to the crossroads with Hecate and having to make a decision, because it's not a choice to not make a decision. Once you're at the crossroads, you've got to make a decision. And if that decision is to turn back, so be it. Maybe not the best way if you're trying to get to a destination, but if it's uncomfortable, then that is a choice. The torches of Hecate illuminating that which is hidden, maybe even forbidden, is part of the reason I believe that she remains to be feared by some people today. Of course, ignorance and misinformation might also be part of that. But fear by itself, a goddess that is powerful, is naturally a goddess that would also be feared. A goddess that brings about personal transformation is perhaps more frightful than a goddess that just takes your hand, smiles, and gives you a chocolate chip cookie. So, journeying to the crossroads with Hecate and accepting the illumination of her torches, of her lamp, of her lights, is a journey of personal transformation. And through personal transformation, it is possible to experience the goddess in a different way, constantly going deeper. And Hecate is a goddess where this really does seem to be the way in which she was viewed. She is conjured so much alongside all kinds of other magical deities, but also by theurgists and by witches and devotees in all kinds of different ways, in all kinds of different traditions. And perhaps we sometimes experience the same crossroads as others who went before us experienced. And for this reason, it's important and helpful when we have access to the experiences of other people so that we can learn from them, not necessarily take those experiences at face value. There's a lot of nonsense that enters the pagan sphere about the gods, and not just Hecate. So to have a meaningful relationship, I feel it's very important to be able to understand the signs and the symbols, and so when we approach that crossroads, that we can act and act appropriately so that we can get to the destination that we have in mind for ourselves. And that sometimes, if a road is blocked to us, just like it might be in the physical mundane world, a road might be closed for some reason, that we are willing to make the effort to find another way to actually get to our destination. The other way may be more inconvenient, it might take a little bit longer. So in conclusion, I am a very strong believer that the goddess Hecate is a goddess that's relevant to the 21st century as much as she was in the ancient world. And if I had more time, I would sit here and give you hundreds of examples of stories I've heard of transformation, stories where lives were touched by the goddess in one way or another and transformed sometimes in very dramatic ways. I put together an anthology back in 2010 called Agati, Her Sacred Fires, and before that one in 2006 called Agati Keys to the Crossroads, all of which contains the experiences of different devotees and the knowledge and ideas that they gained through the experiences they had with the goddess and the visions they had of her. And that, for me, was a transformative period in my own devotion, learning about the experiences of all these people. And we can absolutely continue to use the tools that are available to us today, the internet, of course, being one of them, being used today here by the Scottish Pagan Federation because their physical conference had to be cancelled. So they found another pathway, and I'm sure that for the organisers this has been a different experience, perhaps not what they were expecting. There was probably some bumps in the road, because that is what comes sometimes when a road is blocked and you really want to go down that way but is not available. When we draw back the veils of ignorance and illusion, of the intellectual and emotional barriers that we have in our way, we are better able to find the deities and spirits that we seek. Hecate, or the many other gods and goddesses, the many spirits associated with her, the daimones, all of them, knowing how to read the symbols, understanding the signs that we encounter when we get to the crossroads is essential. And that comes through study. It also comes through practice and experience. And the illumination, for me, of Hecate is not just the physical and esoteric meaning of the illumination of her torches, but also the illumination of gnosis, the knowing, the knowledge that comes with a certain type of experience of the goddess. These experiences sometimes come fast and easy for those who are new to magical practices and new to exploring the mysteries of the gods. They become inspired and the experiences can be quite intense. And I often get asked what to do when somebody cannot feel that connection in any given moment. And this is where the need for spiritual highs that are so popular in some circles needs to be addressed as well. That spiritual high that you feel, that power surge when you're exploring the mysteries of a goddess for the first time, or you're still very new and the practices are new and different, is not something that can be easily replicated. But then, would we always want to go back to the beginning? Those surges of power and energy that we get at the beginning, in search of something new, in search of the shinier, newer trend or fashion? I think not. Hecate is incredibly popular at the moment, primarily due to the work of many very enthusiastic devotees today that have made the information about her so much more widely available in books and blogs on YouTube. So many devotees sharing their work, and that's a good thing. But it's also been popularized through things like Sabrina, where Hecate has become a very primary goddess in the most recent series. And perhaps this is a way that Hecate shows herself and inspires a new generation of devotees to explore her mysteries, to learn more about her. For most people, it is just a bit of fun, an illusion, something that will not go much further than just watching the episodes. But for some, it might continue on to something deeper. I'm sure some of you started your interest in witchcraft, in paganism, in magic by reading or watching some kind of fictional fantasy story or film. So it shouldn't just be ignored when this is the case. It's something that should be embraced. Just go with it. Don't see it as fact. Look beyond the veil and learn more. But if you get to that point where the newness and the excitement has worn down and you're feeling a little bit down, my advice would be to continue your studies, read, go back to sources. There's so many books and websites available today. There's really no excuse. Delve into the experiences of other devotees. Ask people. Start discussions. Read and use the things that inspire you when you're reading as the subject for contemplations and meditations. Do devotional rituals. Keep a shrine and keep that shrine refreshed. Clean it. Pack away all the unnecessary things that end up on a shrine and start it fresh, new. Cleaning away the debris and trying to see through the illusion and the intellectual, emotional barriers that we create. You may not feel the same adrenaline, but you'll develop a deeper and different relationship with deity. And I hope that when you arrive at the Crossroads of Illumination, that Hecate will be there, rather than just the LED lights of the street light above, and that she will give you signs and symbols to interpret if that is your path. Honouring Hecate does not mean that you have to give yourself fully over just to one deity. I'm personally a polytheist. I believe in the existence of many gods and many spirits. You don't have to worship her above all others like in the theogony. You don't have to honour her exclusively. But if you do want to have that connection, then effort will be required on your side to make that relationship a good one. Like all relationships, it's a two-way thing. My experiences at the Crossroads have been awesome, amazing, illuminating, but they've also sometimes been dreadfully sad and scary experiences. No path of transformation comes without those difficult situations. So I hope that you will go forth with a little bit more knowledge of Hecate. I know I can talk a lot, and that perhaps I've said things that you are already familiar with, but hopefully I've also said a few things that are new to you. And I would benefit and love it if you listen to this and you learn something new. You found out something that you didn't know before. Something I've said has sparked something good for you. Or even if you disagree with something I've said, I would love it if you got in touch and if you let me know what it is. And if you've got an experience that you would love to share with me, I would love to hear. It might take me a little while to get back to you, but I would love to hear from you. And at the full moon in May, we're celebrating the Rite of the Sacred Fires, which is a ritual I wrote, a little ritual, it's very short, that I wrote in 2010. and which has become a yearly celebration of devotion to the goddess internationally. So that's something to check out if you want to connect with other people. It's a good way of connecting with other devotees from all kinds of different backgrounds and traditions. And likewise, if you're looking for more information, have a little look at the Covenant of Agati website and explore the resources made available on there by devotees. There's also links, etc., to other sources. So, without further ado, thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you enjoy this online conference. Many blessings and lots of love from Glastonbury.